politicians, academia members, journalists, activists, primarily in Baltics, Visegrad 4 countries, as well as Western Balkans, to search for the answers how complex is the world of disinformation, also to understand how societal vulnerabilities actually are helping to, the societies are open to the harmful influence of the disinformation. The project is based on media monitoring research, primarily online media monitoring research, as well as polls, public opinion polls. So this also helps us to gather with some well-established groups within these regions and also prominent individuals. So with this, actually, I would like to expand more on our panelists here. I'm very privileged to have them here. So I would like to start with Veronika Vihova, so to present us, the findings of the Kremlin Watch. Thank you, Veronika. I think
Thank you for the introduction. As was mentioned, I work for the Kremlin Watch program of the European Values think tank based in Prague, the Czech Republic. So I presume it's not going to be a shocker that I'm going to talk about pro-Kremlin and pro-Russian disinformation. This is not my presentation. Well, anyway, just to give you a little bit more information about what is it that we do. We started the Kremlin Watch program in 2015. It was shortly after the annexation of Crimea and the start of the war in eastern Ukraine. And this is when we started noticing the increasing amount of disinformation, not only about Ukraine, but at that time specifically about Ukraine, in Czech online media space. And we started to monitor those disinformation. We started doing fact-checking. And soon after, we realized that disinformation do not exist in a vacuum. They are not the goal in itself. They are usually complementary and supportive of other tools of influence. And many of them were either inspired or directly taken from the Russian narratives and official Russian statements and messaging of the official Russian state channels. We recognize several of those tools that are supporting each other, apart from disinformation operations, which you can imagine a lot of things behind that, not only fake news in the media, but also the activities of automated bots on social media. We also recognize intelligence operations or espionage. We recognize the support of high-level political allies or extremist groups, populists, in some cases even paramilitary groups. We recognize influence by NGOs, or more likely gongos, so basically fake NGOs which are actually directed by state actors. We do recognize also economic operations which have political goals, and a few others. I don't want to go into incredible detail because I don't have that much time. But we believe that in each and every country in Europe, the combination of those tools is a little bit different. So where we think Russia is really good at is identifying weaknesses and divisive topics and sort of using them and abusing them to their own benefit. And those tools are being used to undermine democratic institutions, to undermine the trust of the citizens into solid quality media. And as a result, often those people who have been impacted by disinformation and other tools of influence have bigger tendencies to vote for extremists, populists, look for alternative sources of information which are often very shady and non-transparent. And this is all very harmful to the democratic systems in Europe. We have this model of how we believe the Kremlin is trying to sort of get more and more involved in domestic affairs of other countries with the final goal of state capture. It sounds very vicious, and it is a little bit of a vicious circle. So it starts usually with influence, or projecting influence by identifying different points. For example, if a politician has lack of money for their campaign, or if they're ideologically close, they can sort of start supporting them through media attention or financially in some, even though those are rare cases. And after that, there is a very crucial point, which is a strategic deal. And when we speak about disinformation, this is something we don't talk about often enough, I think. Strategic deal is something that usually regards strategic sectors like energy, like financial sectors, infrastructure. And by making such a deal, you know, imagine Russian state companies like Rosatom or Gazprom, Russia can sort of project its influence in a way after which it's really difficult to go back on that line. So I think a good example is Hungary, because even you know, after they made the intergovernmental agreement with Russian government on building the Paks 2 nuclear plant, they got sort of indebted to Russia for many years to come. And even if the Hungarian government changed now, it would be very difficult to sort of back off that deal. And after that, disinformation usually starts to play an even bigger role to sort of paralyze the opposition, to support or harm different candidates. And after a long, long time, the final goal could be the soft regime change or the model of state capture. This is very rare. This is not something that would be common in Europe, but you can imagine maybe Belarus or Cyprus, countries like that. Hungary would be somewhere around the partial elite capture. Germany would be somewhere before the strategic deal, and we will see how the Nord Stream 2 goes. So what is the impact of those activities? Not just disinformation, but all the other ones. Specifically in the Czech Republic, between 25 to 40% of people are susceptible to disinformation narratives. We tested some of them in 2016, so it's, the data are not the most new as they can be, but we don't have a lot of reasons to believe that it somehow changed. So about 25% of people actually prefers alternative and non-transparent media sources and has more trust in them than into traditional and public media. You can see that pretty significant numbers of people are convinced that Ukraine is ruled by a fascist government, that the refugees from Syria are the responsibility of the United States, that the war in eastern Ukraine has been caused by NATO or the EU. And those are all very alarming things, and they actually do impact the policy of the country, because if you're a foreign minister and you have 30% of people believing that Ukrainians are fascists, it's going to be very difficult for you to support Ukraine in their endeavors. Just a few days ago, Nielsen Atmosphere conducted another survey which showed that about 25% of Czechs over the age of 15 thinks that EU is organizing and orchestrating migration of the Muslim countries to Europe. And the second revelation was about the elderly. So almost every fifth person over the age of 55 believes that the anti-government demonstrations in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary are funded by George Soros. I think probably everybody in this room has sometimes been accused of being funded by George Soros. So I don't think it comes as a surprise, but still, it's a pretty significant amount of people. So what can be done about it? In the Kremlin Watch, we mostly focus on policy development and recommendations for governments, what they can do to protect their countries against disinformation and other types of influence of authoritarian regimes. And we are very well aware that it doesn't have to be necessarily only Russia that does this. And there is a lot of things, I'm not going to go through of them, but I think transparent financing is where it all starts. Not only financing of political candidates during elections, but also, for example, different websites and media channels, because there is a lot of them where we have no idea who publishes there and why. it should be somehow a part of our national security strategies and documents. If you identify hybrid threats, as we sometimes call it, or influence operations, or disinformation a priority in your foreign policy or internal security strategy, then it's much easier to respond to it in a meaningful way. Pro-Kremlin actors, either their official channels or their proxies, should be scrutinized and investigated. This is mostly the role of investigative journalism, but also sometimes of activists who can really name and shame them in public and raise the awareness about why and what they are exactly doing. There can be specialized institutions like stratcom units in different ministries which shouldn't have the ability to take down content or censor anyone, but who should be able to monitor the media environment and respond to it in their own way if they see something dangerous is spreading on the internet, for example. We should understand societal attitudes better. So I showed some polls that we did. I think similar polling should be done in every country every year so that we could actually see how this changes and what the differences between different regions are. And we should have stronger European response. And this is up to each and every country that is part of international institutions. So the EU has a unit on defending against disinformation. NATO has a unit, and the speakers from those units are here. So we think that those units should be better supported financially, personally, and they should be used as platforms for sharing experiences and lessons learned. And then also it's about adequate education, not only media literacy for high school students and primary school students, but also teaching the teachers who teach media literacy, and also possibly better university programs on Russia specialists so that we better understand what the strategies and tactics behind all of this are. So this is all from me so far. I'm looking forward to any questions you might have later.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I would now give a floor to Rumena Filipova from Center of the Study of Democracy. And I'm sure that she will have many things to share with us about research on the malicious influences that they discovered. Thank you. I think it should be. Yeah.
Yeah. So here is the presentation. How do I move this?
Okay.
Ah, yeah, right.
Just on back.
So I'm going to talk about the national and regional environments which facilitate disinformation, and also the more specific tactics and means of disinformation operations as they're conducted by Russia, by focusing more specifically on the Black Sea region. And I'm going to share some of the findings that we at the Center for the Study of Democracy have been able to generate through past and ongoing projects. So our most recent study on Russian disinformation and propaganda, Russian influence in the media sectors of the Black Sea countries, explores the soft power dimension of the Kremlin's strategies for leverage in the region. And we focused on 5 countries from the Black Sea area, including Bulgaria, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and Armenia, within the time frame of 2015 to 2017. And we selected 3 media outlets from the pro-Russian spectrum in each of those countries. And our main methods focused on content analysis and also the investigation of final beneficial ownership. And our main argument and findings is that the patterns of ownership, economic dependency, and also the informal and formal political links that media outlets have to pro-Russian groups and interests result in particular patterns of propaganda dissemination, pro-Russian propaganda dissemination. So this means that we identified consistently reproduced similarities and differences among the media outlets of the 5 countries as regards propaganda dissemination. So on the one hand, there are very significant commonalities of narration of narration and style as part of the pro-Russian tilt of these media outlets, but there are also significant differentiations among the media channels. And to put it briefly, the more closely politically, economically enmeshed a given media outlet is to pro-Russian groups and interests, then the more straightforwardly it represents Russian propaganda. And of course, apart from these general similarities and differences among the media outlets of the 5 countries, we also identified significant differences across those countries, and of course the specificities of the national media landscapes determine different levels of susceptibility to pro-Russian propaganda. So my main point here is that the deployment of the financial instrument and the creation of political opaqueness on the part of Russia in these countries conditions the overall environment. It shapes the environment in the long term, which in itself facilitates the dissemination of propagandist messages in a variety of ways through different mechanisms and tactics, including through the types of topics and messages that are being disseminated. And I would like to go through those very briefly. So with regards to the common themes that we identified for investigation, including the war in Syria, elections, interference, and also energy issues, we saw that there were recurring and repetitive types of topics and narratives through which these themes were represented. For instance, if we take the war in Syria, we see that there are recurring topics, for instance, the superiority of Russian military equipment, the success of the Russian military and diplomatic involvement, and as opposed to that, the shortcomings of the Western involvement. And there was a very important recurring message about the importance of equal Russian-Western cooperation as a way of solving the Syrian crisis. And the same also goes for elections interference and energy issues. These themes are also related to commonly recurring topics and narratives emanating from the Kremlin's political agenda. We also identified significant similarities with regards to narration and style, which means that there was a very important overarching reliance on sensationalist as against proof-based coverage, and a number of literary techniques stood out. For instance, binary oppositions, the representation of the world in black and white terms, also the deployment of sarcasm, evocation of strong feelings, including moral outrage, hatred, also analytical, unjustified analytical and historical narratives were usually drawn, as well as the extrapolation of generalizations from single opinions or singular situations. Also, conspiracy theories, the circulation of conspiracy theories is a very important technique. And we further identified significant similarities with regards to referencing authorship and quotations, which means that there was a very significant reliance on Russian news agencies. The Russian official political view was most ubiquitously quoted, and the authors of comments and opinion pieces tended to be of Russian origin and or Russian disposition. So overall, all of these means and techniques of influence and propaganda dissemination resulted in the overall portrayal of Russia in positive terms and of the West in negative terms. So binary positive negative portrayals of Russia in the West. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning, we identified differentiations among the media outlets of the 5 countries. And to put it briefly again, we saw that the more closely politically and economically enmeshed a given media outlet is to pro-Russian groups and interests, then there was a very close and straightforward dissemination of Russian messages and in a explicitly biased style of communication. And finally, I would like to focus on some of the cross-national differences, which are determined by the specific characteristics of the national media landscapes. In the case of Bulgaria, it showed some levels of resilience to Russian propaganda, and here an important facilitating factor is related to a lack of an inherited official Russian media impact, which means that there are no Soviet-era descendants channels, and the penetration of Russian channels since 1989 has been negligible. The decline of knowledge of Russian language also has to be noted. In the case of Ukraine, the extent of propaganda coming from the Kremlin has also been limited by the very specific political context, which is, of course, severely critical of Russian military aggression. And also here we have to note the legislation that is being passed on language, and in the fact that 75% of TV content has to be in the Ukrainian language, and the online media space is bilingual. Also, similarly, in the case of Georgia, the public discourse cannot be completely overrun by Kremlin messaging because of the strongly asserted Euro-Atlantic identity and orientation of the country. And we should also note that only 18% of Georgians inform themselves from Russian TV sources. And finally, in the case of Moldova and Armenia, we noted the most unified and overlapping propagation of Kremlin messages for a variety of factors, but importantly, here we can chart out the extensive retention of media ties to Russia, and also the significant popularity and knowledge of the Russian language. In the case of Moldova, 40% of the population informs itself from Russian media sources. And I would like to conclude by saying a few words about our ongoing projects. Now we have just started a comparison of Russian disinformation and propaganda in Central East and Western Europe. So we are going to take again a comparative and context-sensitive approach, but this time we're looking at a number of Central and East European countries, including Bulgaria, Poland, and the Czech Republic, and we're comparing them to France and Germany. And our main goal is to identify differentiated vulnerabilities across the countries, and also to compile best practices and gaps, meaning the most and least successful responses to pro-Russian propaganda in these countries. And overall, our main goal is to create a multi-stakeholder, multi-actor platform for engagement, which will create sustainability in our effort to fight Russian propaganda. Thank you.
Okay, Romana, thank you so much. I would now give the floor to Amélie Henle, who's coming from Oxford Internet Institute. And I had a little sneak in your presentation, so you were mentioning cyber troops. I would like really to hear about it. But what is also interesting to me, and maybe you can answer that question, during your presentation, why Serbia among all other, if I'm not wrong, European Union countries?
That's a good question, actually. We're trying to incorporate as many countries as possible, and unfortunately, for now, we only have data on Serbia. We also looked at Croatia, and we're trying to look at Bosnia and Herzegovina as well. But it's an ongoing project, so short disclaimer, most of the information that I will be showing you is preliminary, so we're still trying to fact-check and corroborate sources and peer review all the materials that we have out so far. I will... So I'm a graduate student at the Oxford Internet Institute, and I'm also a researcher for the Comprop project. So that stands for Computational Propaganda, and generally investigates the interaction of automation, algorithms, and politics. Within the Computational Propaganda Research Project, there are several different projects that are being done, one of which is the Global Cyber Trip Report, which I'm working on. And I brought you some data from European countries, as this is the topic for this panel. So it's not working. It is working. Lovely. So global cyber troops, we generally define them, or we generally look at state actors. Okay, I figured out the technology. And so state actors are here defined as governmental authorities and institutions. So that can be the military, ministries, things like that, as well as political parties of some sort of a national weight. And in particular, I'm looked at several countries in Europe, mainly European Union, as you've mentioned already. So I brought you some information on 10 different countries. Those are Sweden, the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, France, Spain, Austria, Italy, Serbia, and Greece. And so I decided to focus on a little bit of a different thing than what we are particularly focused on within the Global Cyber Trip Report, because I thought that would be interesting for this particular talk. So we came across several examples in most of the countries that we looked at, not just the European ones, on disinformation through hyperpartisan news. And so this is quite influential, as it sort of stirs up public debate, and then these hyperpartisan news, you can't really, that's why they're in quotation marks. They're more stories rather than news, but they're sold as news, but really they trade on conspiracy and disinformation and fake news to affect public opinion and usually support some version of a political party. And this happens through state actors. So political parties sometimes disseminate these kind of disinformation, hyperpartisan news themselves. So a great example here, for example, is the Syriza party in Greece, which has its own sort of disinformation task force, or had it in the last general election, where they really focused on spreading misinformation about other parties in particular and influencing the public opinion through that. You also have this happening through newspapers. These are usually affiliated with one party or another, or have some sort of political opinion themselves, but they're not state actors in themselves. They're private or civil actors as such. Interestingly, here within all the information that I brought you is that in the case of Serbia, that's sort of the only case where we found information directly saying, okay, there are governmental tabloids that are controlled by the party currently in power, the Serbian Progressive Party, I believe is what they're called. And so that is quite unusual for all the other countries, but then again, all the other ones are from the European Union, so that might be one of the reasons. But we haven't really found much other countries where we found this particular reports and saying, okay, these are tabloids that are controlled by the government, rather than just saying they are affiliated with parties that are in the government. And then lastly, a lot of these news are also disseminated via social media. And here we have sort of different versions of the ways that these are disseminated. So we have a lot of bot activity, trolls online, mainly on Twitter, as well as any form of other automated messaging. And there's sort of two main narratives here that we came across, one of which is, again, the one where it's political parties, so state actors themselves, engaging in these kind of activities. So for example, in the case of the UK, most of the bots that you found, the Twitter bots, but also Tinder automatization, that was something that parties did themselves. So Tinder, for example, was mainly used by the Labour Party in the last elections. And you found Twitter activity during the Scotland referendum, during the Brexit referendum, during the last election, all of which supported all the different parties, all the different opinions, and were usually engaged by the parties themselves. You have sort of different approach to that in other countries such as Sweden, for example, where Twitter bots also flooded the internet during the last general election period, and it's not quite clear where they actually come from. So a lot of times, which would be the case in Spain and France, for example, the culprit or the way that people point their fingers is usually at Russia and saying, oh, the Internet Research Agency or something like that is behind all of these activities. But in Sweden, we actually concluded, or we're not sure where these bots come from, but we think it's probably not Russia because of the high fluency in Swedish that these bots have. And most experts agree that there's limits to even the Russian influence machinery. So they're probably originating from within Sweden. And as I said, that's different in, for example, France and Spain. So in the case of Spain, during the Catalan referendum in 2017, there was a high amount of Twitter botnet activity spamming the online space and disseminating information about police brutality, which happened to some extent, but they abused pictures from years and years ago of different protests that partly not even originated in Spain to say, look, this is the bad violations and the bad attacks that the police perpetrated here in Catalonia, which really wasn't the case. And Spain themselves, the central government said they think that Russia is behind that, or well, rather Russian-affiliated or Russian-supported news, so Sputnik or Russia Today. But it's not really clear. And in the case of France, I somehow forgot that, my apologies. There's also some quite influential Twitter trolling activity mainly going there. A recent example would be the hijacking of the Notre Dame fire, which right-wing trolls use to sort of push an anti-immigrant, anti-Islam narrative to say that immigrants, and mainly Muslim immigrants, caused the fire, even though we know it's an accident, but they didn't really care about that. I could go on and on about this table, essentially, for another 20 minutes, but we are running out of time. So if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to ask me or come and talk to me. I'm happy to give you a lot more information. Otherwise, if you want to read about these reports or other reports, there's a Global Cybertruth report from 2018, one from 2017 available online. Check out the website. There's also some other reports there that you can find. There's one on WhatsApp in the recent Indian election that is quite interesting to read, and we'll also come out with a report on the European Union particularly and disinformation activities during the EU election. Late May, early June, we're not sure yet, but stay tuned. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. So I would like to invite Maja Maričić from European External Action Service to talk to us. You know, we have European elections coming, so what is the environment where we are now?
Thank you very much, Biljana, and thank you to the Point Conference for giving us the floor to tell you what keeps us busy these days and how we take disinformation and why we think it matters. I come from the European External Action Service, the Foreign Policy Service of the European Union, from a team of strategic communicators, including an embedded team of a dozen or so disinformation experts that have been tracking and exposing Russian disinformation since 2015. So the work on countering Russian disinformation in particular has not been new to us. What is new is that we have broadened the scope of our research, of our understanding of disinformation, and also our actions. And I can talk about it a bit later. But I would also like to present you with a background of what we're facing now from a Brussels perspective. And this is the atmosphere of the upcoming European elections that are about to happen in 7 days' time, and which have actually brought to the light the question of open societies, open democratic societies, where we believe that they are based on the opportunities of citizens to access verifiable, truthful information without this access being hindered, that would enable their informed participation in political processes, such as elections, and for them to be able to express freely their political will. This is increasingly being challenged by deliberate and very widespread disinformation operations. This is unfortunately coupled with at least 3 additional factors. First of them being the information landscape in Europe and across Europe, which shows very diverse set of vulnerabilities to all those who wish to influence public debates or disrupt public trust in democratic processes. Second of all, it also the fact that we have a increasing lack of trust of citizens in media and in many cases also in government actually adds to the vulnerability in societies. 85% of citizens across Europe think that disinformation and fake news are threats to democracies. 73% of internet users think that there is a threat to elections. Thirdly, this is also amplified by the nature of internet, where we can all be anonymous and where we all have very cheap means to spread disinformation, create and spread disinformation if we want to. What kind of effect that can have on election processes? The picture is very dire. First of all, it can influence voting. It can affect people's perceptions and people's access to information in a sense that they cannot make an informed voting options. But more than that, it can help increase polarization, which is a more long-term effect on any democratic processes, building on the us versus them narratives and also using artificial support to amplify particular or certain views. Long-term also it affects citizens' trust of people being, for example, indirectly or directly encouraged not to go to vote. And also sort of brings into the light, whether we want to talk about it or not, the influence of external actors who want to disrupt elections and democratic processes inside Europe. What we're doing about it is actually we're doing quite a lot and across the board. European elections are one imminent exercise of democracy across Europe, but we have taken a much more broader and comprehensive approach to fighting disinformation. My team was one of the lead services in developing and promoting the EU action plan against disinformation, adopted by the European Commission and EAS in December last year and presented to member states. And actually, it takes a very comprehensive approach to countering disinformation. First of all, it invites everybody, European institutions, but also member states, and I think even more general, is to start with understanding disinformation better. We're very realistic about it. We need to know more to be able to address it. We need to be able to detect it, analyze it, and expose it in a much more systematic way. Second of all, we need to work together. For us, this means working much more together with member states, helping to have a coordinated and joint response across the European Union when we have instances of targeted, well-orchestrated disinformation campaigns. It's an issue for everybody. It spills over very easily, and we have seen so many cases of that. Second of all, we need to work together with the tech. And this is one of the big strands that the European Commission has initiated last year, inviting the big tech companies. For us, primarily at the moment, these are Google, Mozilla, Facebook, and Twitter, to play their role in enabling citizens free, unhindered access to information, but also stepping up their accountability in countering inauthenticated behavior and disinformation that happens on the platforms. And lastly, raising awareness and strengthening our resilience. With all that we're doing, if we're not talking about it, it won't have as big impact as we would like. We need to, when we understand better what we're dealing with, we are analyzing it, and this is our approach. We are exposing it. We're speaking about what kind of negative effects disinformation can have on a society, what long-term measures can be taken to counter it. One of them is awareness raising. Second of them is definitely supporting communities of fact-checkers, researchers, academia, linking up with them, helping build systematic body of evidence on what's happening, on what can be done about it, and also working to support professional journalists, independent media, and maintain high quality and high professional standards when it comes to media reporting. And we have also, this is not just a piece of paper, we are investing resources into this, both human and financial resources, and there are many programs that are running and that will be coming up in the EU budget 2021-2027 that will go into this direction of building capacities of our partners, which we think that are fact-checking community and media, because we're in this together. We think that this is an issue of societal resilience, regardless of whether this information comes from external actors, state or non-state actors, political or economic drivers. It's a matter of societal resilience. We all have a role to play in countering it, and it definitely requires a very long-term approach.
Thank you, Maya. And I think last but not the least, the only gentleman here is Martin Hirsch, and he's from Center of European Policy Analysts. And I would really like him to, tell us about the work of the organization and the insights that he can share with us.
Yep. So essentially I'm with CEPA, a Washington-based think tank, but also for the last 5 years I've been just researching Russian influence in Latvia. That's my primary focus. And I want to, not to talk about the research so much, I'm going to put it in a bigger focus, because today and yesterday we talked quite a lot about how to measure influence, and that's a big topic, because there are different things. There are outputs and outcomes. So outputs is essentially everything Russia does. If you look at Russia Today, Sputnik, other ways of influence, very good content. This method of manipulation, this misleading narrative, this story, that story. So if you look at what Russia does, it looks like it's doing pretty well. The content is very good. A lot of tweets, a lot of retweets, a lot of likes, a lot of shares. It's doing pretty well. But this doesn't measure the influence. It just shows what Russia does. And if you look at what Russia does, it seems we're losing. Much harder it is to measure outcomes, whether people actually believe and follow and really truly embrace these stories put forward by Russia. Because if you scroll something on Facebook, if you like it, if you share it, doesn't mean you're going to remember after 5 minutes what you have shared or what you have liked. So this is much harder to see what are these core inner beliefs of the people. Because what we did in Latvia a couple of years ago, in another research center where I worked at, so we also did similar stuff as Kremlin Watch, try to see how many people agree with these, well, pro-Russia stories. Definitely not Russian influence, but these pro-Russia stories. So is NATO a threat? Is fascism on the rise in Latvia? Are Russians discriminated in Latvia? So these stories that essentially put you kind of in a Russian sphere of influence. If you agree with these stories, if Russia puts some more radical narratives forward, these people who agree with them are more likely to believe more radical stories. So we got a similar number. 20% of our population agree with these stories that are beneficial to Russia. But surveys are a very blunt instrument. So what we did afterwards, we did focus groups, interviews with people who believe this stuff. And then to the question, so NATO is a threat, please explain, what do you mean by that? Majority of people, they don't really have a good answer. So NATO, UN, US, EU, it's a threat somehow. They don't really care about that. They can repeat this propaganda slogan. They hear it again and again, NATO is a threat. But when you ask them, so explain, what do you mean by that? They don't have content behind it. And with these other questions we had, it's the same thing. Majority of people who agree with these pro-Russian narratives, it's not a deeply held belief. They don't have any content behind it. That's one thing. So essentially these outputs, amazing, cool propaganda. If you look at survey data, 20–40% agree with this. When you talk and interview these people in depth, especially do sociology on them, then very often, yes, there are people who truly believe it and are very willing to argue passionately. A lot of them, not really the case. You might have 20% of people saying that NATO is a threat. Doesn't mean much by itself. Then two other things that you have these beliefs. So 20% say that, yes, we believe NATO is a threat. And then you have actually actions, what these people will do. Because in a lot of European countries which are religious, so people say in Poland, we are religious, we're Catholic. Do they go to church? Not really, not so much as 10 years ago. So the number of churchgoers goes down. So beliefs, attitudes expressed in surveys do not predict whether people will act in certain ways. So this is even harder to predict and to research whether people are willing, to protest, for example, or to change their behaviors. And again, what we did, so essentially first step, essentially these surveys, second step, interviews, focus groups. Another thing we did, essentially these psychological, tests. So are people willing to protest? You can measure that using a specific set of questions. Do people believe that you should fit in society or stand out from the crowd? Again, essentially you measure this, and then the results essentially show that society is not willing to protest and engage in some more radical actions. Very, very few people actually are. You can put them in this box, kind of radical. That's one thing. Essentially, you can try to measure these things to get more precise picture. Another thing is, so this is essentially we should not rely on these very simple methods. Just survey says 20% agree with this story. It's horrible. Well, there's much more you can and you should do. It costs a lot of money, a lot of time. It's hard, but otherwise we get the wrong picture. And talking about the wrong picture. So this topic, disinformation in Europe, it's all around us. It's everywhere. Measles outbreaks in Europe. Poland, Lithuania, France, Romania this year. So since 90s, the number of measles outbreaks, this anti-vaccination propaganda has been going up. So, and only this year, Google removed, so if you Googled vaccinations, 40 out of top 100 sites were anti-vaccination sites. This year, Google removed that. It's, you Google vaccination, you get good information. Facebook banned anti-vaccination pages. YouTube demonetized anti-vax stuff only this year. So this is not just Russian disinformation. There's a lot of stuff. So for example, genetically modified food, it's banned in Europe. Scientific consensus is that GMOs are not harmful. There are misleading food labels, no GMO, sugar-free, gluten-free, and all sorts of stuff that are essentially either useless or is simply misleading. On the street here, you can buy natural pomegranates. They're all natural. You can buy detox water. It means nothing. So this information is all around us. It's not just Russia. And if you have this information all around us in marketing and political campaigns everywhere, then suddenly people believe in strange stories coming from Russia. It's not a surprise, essentially. And this is kind of the last thing, essentially, what to do. If you look at vaccination, so these easy methods, well, we're going to debunk, we're going to fact check, we're going to inform. This doesn't really work. We're one of the few things that has been effective. In Australia, they made people pay fines if they don't vaccinate their kids. Essentially not fines, simply remove their social benefits. Vaccination rates went up. For the last decade, there has been information, fact-checking against anti-vaxxer stuff. We have measles outbreak in Europe. So now Google, Facebook, YouTube essentially doing drastic measures, removing this content, and probably this is going to work. So essentially, it's very, 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 very hard to focus on stuff that has real impact, not on just these flashy things. So Russia Today, Sputnik. If you research Russian influence in Latvia, if you focus only on Sputnik and Russia Today, it's irrelevant. No one listens to it. It's easy to research this, and there are a bunch of researchers doing stuff, Russian influence in Latvia, Sputnik, Russia Today, but it's irrelevant because no one in Latvia consumes them. So my main 2 points, essentially, well, it's very hard to focus on the real issues, to find the real problems. You get a lot of these buzzwords, sort of information war, information operations, and so on and so on. It's much more complex than that. Disinformation, again, it's not just Russia, it's all around us, but I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to finish with this. Thank you.
Much. So, audience, please, questions, comments, insults. Ilir, I think.
Hi everyone, my name is Ilir. I want to thank all the panelists, but I especially want to thank Martins for bringing up the issue of anti-vaccination campaigns. Because if you didn't mention it, I would leave this room thinking Russia was our only problem. And it has been there have been a few moments in the presentations where terms were used such as binary narratives and us and them, but in my view it was the dominant tone of the debate so far. And I think it's really the wrong way of approaching issues of disinformation in Europe, because equalizing disinformation and fake news with Russia is exactly the way of missing out the point. Thank you.
So
that is probably a question for...
Well, I can answer, I can give the word to others as well. So very briefly, so as I said, disinformation is all around us. So for example, in Latvian elections, we had a ministry, well, time's up, a ministry organizing positivity campaign for essentially the party which ran it. Can we continue, or should we end? Okay, I'm going to continue. So in Latvia, we had a ministry running a positivity campaign for the party, essentially, which runs the ministry. Disinformation mission campaign by our own government, and this happens essentially in most of countries in Europe in some or another form. Then, after the elections, colleagues of mine, they tried to measure whether this had impact. So essentially, did you see this campaign, and who did you vote for? Around the time when this campaign was running, there was a lot of noise in media. This is horrible. This shouldn't be happening. This is simply manipulation. The surveys that Providus in Latvia did, what the outcome was, the people who had noticed this campaign, they didn't vote for this party. They voted against it. Essentially, there's a lot of stuff happening, a lot of disinformation, but whether it influences people to do something, that's a very, very, very complex question. It's not the case that it always well, influences our actions, us versus them.
If it would be given just 2 more minutes.
So if I understand your question correctly, it was about this binary polarization between Russia and the West and the way we're examining it ourselves, right? So I think this is goes to the core of propaganda operations, of disinformation, and we cannot really escape that route, because it's the propaganda is also part of the larger standoff between Russia and the West, where there are larger issues at stake, including the very definition of international relations and who belongs where. Basically, what is the West and what is Russia, and how their relations are defined, and where the Central and East European countries belong in that scheme, because obviously that has been a very thorny issue, a very thorny historical issue, and there have been important ambivalences. So if we take, let's say, the case of Bulgaria, there has been the East-West divide. So on the one hand, Russia is pushing those narratives about where Bulgaria actually belongs in terms of culture, emotions, and historical sensibilities. And if those are closer to Russia, then why does the country belongs to the Euro-Atlantic community? So I think in our research as well, we cannot escape those questions.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that our time is run. So please feel free to discuss all of these things after, during the lunch, and we still have tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Well, first I need to react on something.